Okay, we have Dr. Anthony Fauci. First, I'm not going to do what you see on TV too often, which is where people believe, they pretend to you that they're interviewing somebody that they don't really know. I don't fake the funk, okay? I know Tony Fauci. I care about Tony Fauci. Helped me get through COVID. He's a friend of my family. And I respect his service and his legacy, which is why I'm going to give him a fair shot to deal with what he's being accused of by a lot of power players. You're going to get to listen to his answers, and then in the next segment, you can call in and ask your questions. Dr. Fauci, good to see you.
Thanks, Chris. Good to be with you.
So first, in general, why do you think that you are the target of so many accusations about covering up the source of COVID-19?
Well, Chris, I think it's pretty clear that it's really politically motivated. I mean, the idea of I don't know what they're talking about covering up. I mean, I have been totally transparent throughout, and I'm not sure what they're talking about when they say cover up. I mean, it's no secret that almost all of the incumbent Republican politicians that were running and those who were running for the first time had interspersed in their campaigns, fire Fauci, indict Fauci, hang Fauci. It's a political thing. And I don't know why it started, but I'm sure it was that back during the Trump administration, I had to, in order to preserve my own personal integrity, as well as to fulfill my responsibility to the American public, to tell the truth when the president was saying things that were just not true. Things like hydroxychloroquine is a cure, it's going to fix everything, the virus is going to disappear like magic. I was not comfortable in having to get up and contradict the President of the United States. Of course, I have a great deal of respect for the office of the presidency as well as for all of the institutions of our government. But I had to do that, and that triggered a degree of hostility in which I became a target. And it's gotten worse and worse as we got deeper into the political season of the elections. And now it's continuing now even since then. So, I mean, I'm not 100% sure, but that's as good a guess as any as to why I become a target.
All right, so
I'm
let's
telling
just
people things that are inconvenient.
So let's just deal with what is convenient, which is what the straight line accusations are. First, do you know where COVID-19 came from? Do you know if there's a better chance that it started out in some wet market or that it is from a lab leak?
All right, so let's unpack this and take the facts one by one, carefully and slowly, because in all of the dialogue that goes around, you hear a lot of spouting out of things that don't make any sense. First of all, we don't know definitively where or how the virus evolved. We don't know that. And I have kept an open mind from day one about keeping all possibilities open. There are two possibilities. One, somehow it was worked on in a lab and leaked out. And the other, it was a natural occurrence from the wet market in Wuhan. If you look at the data that are available, that scientists who are good, not good, outstanding evolutionary scientists from all over the world, not just Americans, from all over the world, Australia, the European Union, Canada, some from the United States, have very carefully analyzed the data based on epidemiology, virology, geospatial, and have come to the conclusion that it's more likely that it came from a natural occurrence from the wet market. Having said that, I don't come to any conclusion. I still keep a completely open mind.
All right, so two questions on that.
Might be.
Two questions. One is the common sense one. So it came from a wet market in the same place where there's this huge lab that does all the kind of development of exactly what this thing is. That's some coincidence.
It's a coincidence, but there are so many labs all over China that have both labs and wet markets. If it were in Beijing or Shanghai, you'd be saying the same thing. You have a coincidence at the same time that the big issue is that it's a big city. If it weren't a big city, it likely would not have evolved into a pandemic. Again, Chris, the thing that negates all this nonsense that's going around is that you keep a completely open mind. If it's one or the other of two possibilities, instead of arguing about it, we should do whatever we can to prevent either of those possibilities from occurring again. And that's not what's going on. There's a lot of accusations back and forth that are so completely politically motivated, it's thick.
Well, that's because that's what
motivation.
works. I mean, you and I talk about this all the time, full disclosure to the audience. Tony is not a politician, doesn't get politics, and I was very worried when they put him in front, giving you guys messages about what was happening and what wasn't, that were often, really what I thought the president should have been saying. But in politics, blame works, Tony. And there's more currency in me saying Fauci's dirty than, hey, we should make sure we never have this happen again. Nobody votes for me on that basis. They vote for me because I found an enemy for them. The second point is this, and Dr. Redfield, I would suggest, threw you under the bus the other day, saying that there was a paper commissioned, that you were part of the people who commissioned it, that was designed to discredit or debunk the idea that it came from a lab, and he didn't want to be part of it. I'm not going to play the sound, but that's what Redfield say, just not to take up time.
Right.
That I didn't want to be part of it.
Part of it.
That you didn't want him to be part of it.
That's not what he said.
What he said? Well, hold on. Let's do this. Let's do this, Tony. I'll play it. Play it for the audience so we get it straight.
Yeah, play it.
Go ahead. Play it.
Sure. Please.
Why do you think you were excluded from those calls?
Because it was told to me that they wanted a single narrative and that I obviously had a different point of view.
Do you think that the paper does hide the truth?
I think it's an inaccurate paper that basically was part of a narrative that they were creating. Remember, this pandemic did not start in January at the seafood market. We now know there was infections all the way back into September.
So now they heard what he said, and you know what the suggestion is, that the paper was wrong, but you guys wanted a different story than he was going to tell.
Well, it's really sad, Chris, that he's wrong on every single account, but you don't need to take my word for it. You take the word for the people. He's saying that the phone call to discuss the possibility that this might have been engineered, that I was in charge of the phone call and I deliberately excluded him because his ideas differed from what he interpreted were mine. Well, first of all, he had no idea what my ideas were because I kept a completely open mind. Secondly, I was not responsible. I didn't include or exclude anybody from the call because the people that were responsible for setting up the call were Jeremy Farrar from the Wellcome Trust in the UK, Eddie Holmes from Australia, and a bunch of other very competent evolutionary virologists. So for him to say, and it's sad that he's so wrong, and he's publicly saying that I excluded him. Now, the other thing that's important, he's saying that I excluded him because his idea was different from my idea, and his idea was that it came from a lab. Well, half the people on the call felt it might be from a lab. So his rationale for why he thought he was excluded doesn't make any rational sense. So he on every single level, he's incorrect. So I don't know what he was saying at that hearing or what prompted him to say that. He says, I was told that. Well, if I were one of the people on the hearing, I would have said, well, who told you that? Because it doesn't make any sense and it's not true.
One other question, then we'll go to break and we'll get viewer calls. Dr. Kristen Anderson, it said in an email sent to Nature that Fauci prompted the paper's drafting in order to disprove the lab leak theory. Was the point of the paper to disprove the lab leak theory, and why, if so?
No, absolutely not. The way it was, there was a very open, in good faith discussion during the phone call on February 1st, where very competent evolutionary virologists were going back and forth, and they decided on the phone call, listen, let's take a little time and go back and really carefully examine those sequences and see if, in fact, there's anything to that. They did that, and they came to the conclusion that, in fact, it is more likely that it was not something that was engineered but something that actually escaped from a wet market. And in order to get it peer reviewed, they wrote a paper to let the peer review system evaluate whether it was valid. And it did. And that's how the paper came about. So this idea of saying, write the paper to definitively disprove something is conspiracy at its height, Chris. It's really ridiculous.
I hear you. I appreciate you taking the opportunity to deal with the questions head on. It's the best thing the audience could have. Let's take a break. We'll come back, hear what they have to say. Dr. Anthony Fauci, thank you. Stay with us. You know, Dr. Fauci ran the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases for 38 years. He was in public service for over 50 years. He worked for 7 different presidents. I'm proud to know you, and I'm proud of your service. Thank you for joining us again here, Dr. Fauci. It's good to have you.
Thank you, Chris.
I told you retirement wasn't going to be easy. I told you they weren't just going to let this go. It's got too much currency. I do have one more question for you before we go to the calls. You have always said to me that you have an open mind on what originated this, and your real concern is just how do we stop it the next time? That's where the energy should be. But you have pretty consistently said that you don't believe it came from a lab, that it wasn't manipulated in all likelihood, that this was something that would have a better chance of coming from some organic or natural manifestation. Do you still believe that?
No, but Chris, let me just repeat what I said before. I have an open mind that if there is definitive evidence, one way or the other, I will embrace that and champion that. What we know now is that we don't know definitively, but when you look at the data that has been collected by very competent evolutionary virologists who've studied this very carefully, I haven't done it. It's not my work. This is other people who are the best in the world at what they do. They have written 2 papers now in Science magazine in August of 2022, which strongly suggests that it came from a wet market as a transfer, a jumping species from an animal to a human. Having said that, what I say is that it looks like the evidence weighs more heavily in that direction. That doesn't mean that I'm ruling something else out. That's very important, Chris. I'm keeping an open mind that it might be either, even though the currently available data by good people indicate it's more likely one, but more likely is not definitive.
I agree.
And that's the reason why you must keep an open mind.
I agree. Thank you for the clarification. Dusty, who do you got for the doctor?
Okay, we have a bunch of people that want to speak with him, and we're going to start with Joe from Atlanta, Georgia.
Joe, how you doing? What's the question for the doc?
Hey, Chris, I got a question for him. Dr. Fauci, there were definitely conspiracy theories at the beginning, but it seemed like you were very adamant about shutting down any and all possibilities that the virus came from a lab. Why was that?
No, I wasn't. I mean, you weren't listening to what I just told Chris. If you look at what actually happened, not what people are tweeting and spouting incorrectly, when I got a call from one of the scientists in the UK and in Australia saying that we're looking at the virus and there's a possibility it might have been manipulated, I said, well, the important thing to be is completely open about this. You guys should get a group of evolutionary virologists and look at this very, very carefully. Never once did I say, shut it down and don't talk about it. I did exactly the opposite, despite what you're hearing in all the tweets. And all you have to do is ask a group of people who were involved, and they will tell you very clearly that, in fact, if anybody had a completely open mind about this, it was Dr. Fauci.
Dusty,
sorry, but that's the truth.
Don't be sorry about the truth. Dusty.
Yeah, this is why it's so important that we let these callers on. Connie from Fishersville, Virginia.
Connie, how you doing? What's your question?
Hi. I've been watching on TV, so this is getting confusing. Originally, it was thought that this was a lab accident, and that seemed to make sense. And I'm trying to figure out, why did we get so far off? And, you know, we got away from the lab accident theory that started out, and now we're back to that. So.
Well, I think it's because we never answered the question, Connie. But look, Tony,
Right.
Dr. Fauci, what they're going to on this is there is a suspicion that you had some reason to not want it come from the lab. Address that.
I don't know why there was. I mean, there was this insinuation that since the NIH for decades has been funding with a small amount of money scientists in China to do surveillance work on bats, that somehow the NIH funded something that turned into SARS-CoV-2. Now, there's a really very clear answer to that. If you look at the viruses that the Chinese were working on with money that was supplied by a small grant from NIH, anybody who knows even a little bit about virology will tell you that it would be molecularly impossible for those viruses to turn into SARS-CoV-2. Even if you deliberately tried to do it, you wouldn't be able to do it, because they're evolutionarily so different from each other that everybody who knows anything about evolutionary virology will tell you that isn't even a possibility. And yet there was that innuendo that, well, you know, the NIH funds research in China, so maybe they were the ones that actually created the virus, which is absolutely crazy. But let's get back to something else that the person who called in was alluding to, Chris. If you look at history, the idea that something evolves by jumping species is extremely common. SARS-CoV-1 has been definitively proven, without a doubt, to come from a bat to a civet cat to a human. So the same type of virus in 2002 that we had a mini epidemic there was shown. Ebola comes from an animal to a human. HIV comes from an animal to a human. Influenza comes from an animal to a human. So the idea that something jumps species from an animal reservoir to a human, actually 75 to 80% of all the new infections jump species from an animal to a human. So for people to say that's really quite a reasonable assumption is not something out of line. It just goes along with all of the data that we've accumulated over decades.
All right, last call. Let's take one more.
We're going to go to Jennifer from Marlboro, Maryland.
Hey, Jennifer, thank you for calling. Upper Marlboro, big difference to people who live down there. What do you have for the doctor?
Hi, Chris. It's nice to talk to you. My question is, how worried should we be about the new strain of COVID?
When you say the new strain of COVID, are you talking about new variants? Because the COVID that we're having right now, we've had the unfortunate experience of starting off with a virus, which what we call the original strain, and then we had multiple variants. We had Delta, and then we had Alpha, and we had Beta, and then we had Omicron, and then we have multiple sublineages of Omicron. Right now, the one that's circulating predominantly in the United States is called XBB.1.5. That is something that, you know, obviously escapes the immune system a bit, but fortunately for us, and we're really quite fortunate, probably a combination of the fact that so many people have been infected already, and so many people have been vaccinated, and many, many people, like myself, have been vaccinated and have gotten infected, that there's a degree of immunity in society that's preventing the massive surge that we might have expected in the winter. So even though we're not exactly where we want to be right now, we are much, much better off than we were a year and a half ago.
Dr. Tony Fauci, Dr. Anthony Fauci, I want to say, you are always welcome anywhere I am to discuss what matters, especially when it's coming at you and you want to deal with it and make sure that the record is clear and the clarifications are out there. I appreciate you taking the opportunity. I'll say it again, even though I've said it twice already. Dr. Anthony Fauci is a friend, and I respect his service, and I will be forever grateful for how you helped me when I was sick. I appreciate you, and I wish you the best.
Thank you, Chris. Good to be with you. I appreciate it.
Dr.
Take care.
Fauci, you're always welcome. All right? Get some sun. You're in retirement now, all right? You look like you're still working. Take care. I get him to laugh at some point. All right.